The Crusades, a story of defense and duty. It was the 11th century, and the world was a different place. In the East, the Muslim forces had already expanded their empire for centuries, pushing into lands that had once been under Christian rule. For hundreds of years, Christianity and Islam had been at odds, with the Muslim empire stretching from Spain in the west to India in the east. These lands were rich in history and culture, but for many Christians, the most sacred of all was Jerusalem, the holy city where Jesus had lived, died, and risen again. But by the time the Crusades began, Jerusalem was no longer in Christian hands. It had fallen to Muslim rule centuries earlier, in the 7th century. Christian pilgrims who once traveled to the city were now facing constant threats, harassment, and even violence. For them, the idea of visiting the city where their Savior had walked had become dangerous and often impossible. This wasn't the only problem. To the north, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern bastion of Christianity, was under siege. In 1071, a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Manzikert left the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I, with little defense against the encroaching Seljuk Turks. His empire, which had been a protector of Christianity in the East, was now at the mercy of foreign invaders. The land that had been the birthplace of the Roman Empire was in danger of being lost forever. In desperation, Alexios sent a plea for help to the Christian kings and lords of the West. It was a cry for assistance in defending the remnants of Christian civilization in the East. But this wasn't just a plea for military aid. It was a call to protect the very foundations of Christianity from being overrun. In response, Pope Urban II in 1095 called for a grand assembly in Clermont, France. There, he rallied the people of Europe to take up arms, not for conquest, but for defense. He told them that they must go to the East to defend their Christian brothers and sisters and reclaim the Holy Land from the hands of the Muslims. He spoke of the suffering of Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem and promised forgiveness for their sins in exchange for their courage on the battlefield. For many, this wasn't a war of aggression. It was a duty, a sacred mission to defend their faith and their heritage. Thousands of knights, peasants, and clergy answered the call. They set out on a long and dangerous journey across the Mediterranean, braving harsh terrain, disease, and the threat of hostile forces. Along the way, they weren't thinking of conquest. They were thinking of protection. They were going to the East not to seize land, but to restore what had been taken, to defend their holy sites, and to protect their fellow Christians from further persecution. When the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in 1099, they fought fiercely to reclaim the city. The fall of Jerusalem is often remembered for its brutality, but we must understand that this was a time of brutal warfare everywhere. The Crusaders were not unique in their violence. They were simply part of a larger, centuries-long conflict between two civilizations, one trying to defend what was left of its ancient lands, the other trying to expand. The Crusades, at their core, were not about conquest. They were about responding to centuries of Islamic expansion and protecting the very heart of Christianity. The Crusaders weren't fighting for power or wealth. They were fighting for their faith, their people, and their sacred lands. In the years that followed, the Crusades would grow more complicated, with political motivations and territorial ambitions coming to the forefront. But in the beginning, they were a response to a real and urgent threat. They were a defense against the loss of Christian lands, the protection of Christian pilgrims, and the preservation of the legacy of Christianity itself. The Crusades are often seen through a modern lens of imperialism and violence, but in their time, they were seen as a necessary and just war. They were not the beginning of an aggressive campaign by Europe, but a reaction to the centuries of conflict that had already been unfolding between Christianity and Islam. It was a time when religious and military battles were not easily separated, and for the Crusaders, The fight was about more than just territory. It was about preserving their faith and defending the lands that had been Christian for centuries before the rise of Islam. This is the story of the Crusades, a defense of faith, a response to an ever-expanding empire, and an effort to protect what was sacred in a time of chaos and conflict.